Okay, hello and welcome to Bearded Heretics YouTube. I'm Bearded Heretic, aka Luke, and I'm here with Harry, my friend Harry, who you might remember from Ask a Theist and Ask an Atheist videos. And I'm also
hmm
here with Philip, who you might know from Answers in Reason, and who was also on a previous stream of mine as well. And wow, what a start to to a stream. I don't think I've not had that many technical difficulties before, so it's good to know that they happen, and I managed to improvise. So here we are. So I'm just so distracted. How are you guys? Are you guys doing well?
Yes.
Yeah, solid. Yeah.
Good, good. Um, so I guess today we're going to be talking about uh, scientism. We're going to be talking about science and what its actual role is. Um, are all your beards related? No. No, but we all do have
Uh,
good beards.
they're adopted.
Yeah, they're adopted. They are brothers.
Mm.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, so let me start by asking you guys a question about, what scientism is and what your kind of thoughts are about it. So I don't mind who goes first. Whoever. Harry, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, sure. Um, so, what do you mean? Like a sort of a brief definition, or
Yeah, that would be really good, I think. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, to my understanding, scientism is the veneration of science and the scientific method as sort of the best way of gaining human knowledge that we're ever going to get, often treated as though it makes um, any other form of study sort of obsolete. Um, and like I said, it's this veneration of science. It's almost treating it as if it were dogma.
Oh, okay, thank you. And Philip, do you agree with that? Is there anything you'd add?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the way I would sort of usually see it is like this idea that science has literally all the answers, right? That there is nothing outside of the domain of science. Um, so that would be sort of like a very extreme, I guess, form of scientism. This idea that
Mm.
everything, literally like the answer to every question is going to be sort of in the scientific or answered in the scientific domain.
Yeah, and I guess that's pretty much my understanding of it. And I have to say, there was a point in my life, and I'm sure Harry is aware of this, where I might have been, probably could have been labelled with that ism. um, I definitely felt like science had like was exclusively the way that we kind of gathered knowledge and stuff like that. And me and Harry used to get into lots of debates about kind of philosophy and science and what was the better, or not what was better, but just what the purposes of them were. And I was quite, oh
Well, we were young. We knew everything.
yeah, exactly, yeah, precisely, yeah. And some of the thought experiments I might entertain today, I probably wouldn't have entertained back then. So, you're lucky, Philip. You and Answers to the Reason is lucky because I was one of those people for a while. But
Oh, I was one of them too. I don't know how like sort of extreme, but I had my time of sort of mm, I guess misunderstanding or very superficial understanding of science. I still have arguably not an in-depth understanding of science, but a better one than I used to.
yeah,
And yeah, I had this sort of these types of ideas floating around my head as well.
so I guess at least you and I have been there. Harry, it has always been a bitch to philosophy, so he's always been discussing philosophy and stuff. Went to uni to do it and stuff.
Yeah.
So um, he's not had that issue. If anything, he had the opposite issue. um, from my experience anyway, from my perspective. Maybe it was just that I was too hard on that side to make it, to see that he was actually centrist in it. So I guess part of what we should do now is just understand what science is and what it is used for. So um, I think for me it's a tool that we use. It's a way of gathering information and understanding the world in a systematic, unbiased, objective kind of approach, and it's how we can make advances in technology and make sure that we're kind of like able to live in a really kind of like I think its main purpose for me is to improve human well-being. That's what it should be anyway. And I think gathering knowledge. I had a discussion with Steen, Three Vikings, about this, where I think the very underlying foundation of it is gathering knowledge for knowledge's sake. But I think that is kind of like not necessarily appropriate at all times, and I think that's kind of the problem with a lot of these people that are kind of like empiricists. They think that should be the only goal.
It's it's interesting you say knowledge for knowledge's sake. I've always thought of it more like even though the knowledge you're gaining might not seem relevant now, you can squirrel it away and compare notes, and it might throw up something interesting later. I think the scientific approach, one of the big strengths that the scientific approach has, is it's methodical. It's not everything has to be laid out right away. You can take it step by step and compare notes with yourself from the past and make new discoveries.
That's a good way of thinking about it, I think, actually. Yeah. Philip, what are your thoughts on...
Yeah, I think, like, from my perspective, science has to do with, like, a sort of, I guess, frame of thinking, right? It's not just about sort of using the tools that we have in reasoning, right? Like inductive, deductive reasoning and abductive reasoning and stuff like that. It's sort of going a step further and having an approach where you're actually testing the things that you think about, and thereby sort of accelerate that process, because it's not just about sort of discussing in your armchair, if you could say so, right?
Yeah.
Like this sort of purely rationalist, which I, by the way, love. I have a lot of respect of that, right? I'm not trying to dismiss it, right? But there are certain aspects of our world that can be much quicker iterated upon and discovered, I think, if you step into the world and actually start sort of not only thinking about stuff, but actually sort of thinking about ways of testing what you're saying as well. Sort of this whole approach with an underlying method is sort of what when we get to science, but it has a lot to do with sort of empirical studies and sort of being able to make observations and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of good that science does in that sense. Like like the reason that we
absolutely.
have the technology we have today is down to science. The reason that we have the ability to produce as much food as we do today is down to science. Whether that's ethical or not is a different question. But I suppose that brings us nicely into the reasons that science, we need to be considering science as a tool for a specific purpose, rather than the be all and end all of everything. Because if we're saying, okay, here's a way of and let's use the food production one because that's the one I just came up with. Here's a way of producing food en masse to sustain the current population, right? But then that system isn't ethical. That's not a scientific question.
Yeah.
But then there'll be lots of people who will say, well, science isn't, the only way we can know things is through science. But the way we can know things, whether they're ethical is not through science, because science isn't designed for that. Yeah?
Yeah.
and that's that's the problem that we're facing, is that, you know, when we have like when Philip and I have discussions with people on Twitter, Harry, it gets a bit like kind of murky with these types of people, because they're so entrenched in this understanding of science being the only way we can know things, and being the only way that we can look at things, that when you bring up something like ethics, it's almost like they just dismiss it, and then they get into like a weird kind of like moral subjectivism type approach to it. They'll be like, well, ethics doesn't really exist anyway, and it gets really we go down really dodgy territory where people are saying some.
But even that, right? Like even saying that, I think, is a great example of something that is not sort of addressable scientifically, because saying that sort of ethics is subjective and it doesn't exist or something like that, or error theory, like all of these things are sort of philosophical positions, right? It's something that you would have to argue for in a strictly non-empirical way as well. And I think there are a lot of these types of things which science might inform, right? Like I'm not debating the fact that science can inform ethics, right? Especially if you sort of like say that you're a utilitarian, right, or consequentialist or something like that, right? The science can tell you something about, you know, how humans feel in certain scenarios, right? And what your actions, what consequences your actions can have, and what impact they can have. But standalone, you know, only making those observations and gathering that information is never going to be enough to enable you to say, oh, that's wrong, right? There needs to be some extra work done in sort of your meta-ethical I guess worldview to justify this sort of bridging, I guess, right? So yeah, I think there are a lot of questions that are not strictly empirical that we're facing, and those sort of are not really strictly scientific, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so
go on.
The people who rely too much on empirical evidence tend to have trouble with things that end up being nebulous. Things with no one right answer frustrates the mindset of finding the right answer.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, I think that's really true, because there are, like, you know, ambiguous situations in life. You know, there are situations, especially when you're coming down to like moral concerns, right? You know, there's no answer that is right empirically, unless you are a consequentialist and you're like just measuring the amount of damage that something does. But even that might not be measurable. There might be harm that's caused that might not be measurable harm, or not consistently measurable, like, because it's so dependent on like individuals or something like that and how they react to things, right? So it is very interesting, and I think that it's one of those things that people who are like, like empirical thing is the only way that they know things, they haven't really thought through some of the things that they've experienced themselves. Like, they could say to us, like, I think Joe gives us an example, which is really useful. He talked about how, like, you know, his dad used to be called had a name. I can't remember the name he used, but his dad used to say, "No, I like to be called this name," right? And his dad's passed away, and there's nothing that he can find written down that shows that his dad preferred that name. So how can we empirically verify it?
Sure.
But it's still true. It's still something we know. But there's no empirical verification for that thing. So it's kind of like you're kind of either saying, I don't believe that statement because there's no empirical evidence for it, or you're saying, oh, okay, there are things that I can believe that don't need empirical evidence.
Well, sure, and you have to, and if you're going to take that position as well, you have to take a lot of things on trust from the people around you. You know that you cannot live a life based on things that you can verify for yourself, because it's just not how our modern society works.
Well,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
That's the other part of this whole issue, right? Is that they're talking about science as if it is the kind of like the epitome of knowledge and stuff. But there's two big issues with that, right? One, historically, science has been very wrong in various different spaces, and we have the potential to be very wrong on various different spaces right now. You know, about kind of stuff that is we kind of know, but we're not sure about. Like, I don't know, the formation of the universe, or the way that black holes work, or um, gravitational waves, which you've only just discovered, but we're not quite sure about them. You know, there's various things that we're discovering these days that we're then applying models to. That 50 to 100 years down the line, we may have way more information on, and those models could be completely different. You know, if we think about the structure of an atom, that's a really good example, because we obviously had the plum pudding model, which was that the electrons were inside the nucleus, but now we know the nucleus is the center and there's space between the nucleus and the electrons. But even that, we might not be right about that still, because we haven't ever been able to photograph an atom like that. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like there's issues there about the historicity of science's approach and stuff.
Yeah.
And I've forgotten what the second issue is, because I've spoken for too long.
Well, well, I mean, yeah, what you talk about there should be one of the greatest strengths of a scientific approach to kind of modern information gathering. You know, we collect information as a group, as a species, and with modern communications, we're able to pool our knowledge a lot more effectively, and that, in theory, should lead to thing like what is known being more malleable. You know, we should be updating things more regularly. We should be questioning the things we have. The fact that we have access to all this information in a way that we never did before, like, you would hope it would encourage us to be more flexible in our thinking. But I feel like a lot of people have gone the other way with it. They've sort of started to their structure of how the world works has become more solidified,
Yeah,
due to this idea of information gathering, where it should start to become more maneuverable.
that's so true. And actually, I think a really good example of that is where, because I feel like people think they understand psychology, right? I think a lot of people think they understand psychology without having done any reading into it. And a lot of the things you learn when you do a psychology degree is that our psychology is really counterintuitive. So our intuition doesn't match up with what the research says. Yeah. And there's been various situations where I've been discussing one of the biggest ones, Harry, is religion as a mental illness, right? That's been something that's been ongoing for the past like few weeks, where everyone, oh, not everyone, that's an exaggeration.
Unfortunately not.
Lots of people are saying that religion, that the belief in a god, is a mental illness, right? Which is crazy, ironically. So I come in and I say, look, I've got qualifications in this field, and I've worked in the field for many years, so I have a good understanding of this. And I explain to them my understanding of it, and then they go, prove that you have the qualifications. I want you to send me your degrees. Like, they'd rather believe their false narrative than believe that I have the qualifications I say I have, even though I'm using the words in the right way, I'm expressing myself. There's no reason for me to lie in that situation. Like, why would I go into a Twitter fight being like, yeah, I have qualifications in this field, and be lying? Like, that makes no sense. I'm sure there's people that do it, but
There are, yeah, but it's certainly not the first thing you'd think.
no, exactly. You'd go, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. I'm going to listen to them because I am an empiricist and I believe that science is the only true thing, right? But then they don't. They don't, because it doesn't match with their schemas and their scripts about the world. It doesn't match with their view on what the world should be like. So if they think that, you know, religion isn't if they think religion is a mental illness, and they've witnessed it and they feel like they know what mental illness is, and then someone who's actually qualified says, that's not how it works, then they're like, whoa, How can I maintain this belief?
That's sort of at least part of that issue is born of people having more access to the surface level of fields which go much deeper, but they don't actually have the understanding of those fields. If I'm making sense, people
Yeah,
people today are more able than their parents' generation, for example, to talk about different kinds of personality disorder or the differences between a psychotic episode and a hallucination. You know, but just because they or like people don't share anymore. They trauma dump. That's they get these sort of like they get the surface level understanding of something, and then they apply it as if that's the be all and end all. That there's no more to learn, and it sort of ends up giving their opinions more gravitas, but not actually more depth. So then, when somebody who does have more subject knowledge, like yourself, comes along and tries to explain sort of something that comes from the depth of that knowledge, they could end up rejecting it because they feel like they understand it
yeah,
already.
yeah. So I think a good example of that is like some of the definitions in the DSM use purposefully vague language, right?
Mm.
So it might say, somebody who's depressed goes through a long period of feeling low, um, feels lethargy, feels I don't know, like hopeless or worthless, um, maybe having sleeping too much or sleeping too little, etc. Right? So I'll have this list of stuff, and then
Mm.
people will read that, and then they'll take the very kind of smallest version of what that means and apply it to people that they know. So sleeping too much or too little, they might think, well, I slept 10 hours instead of 8 hours. Or I slept six
Sure.
hours instead of 8 hours. Oh, I'm lethargic. I feel a bit tired, right? I feel a bit hopeless because I don't know, like they don't feel hopeless entirely, but they like in
Yeah.
the way that we mean it, but they think what's the point occasionally? But actually, hopeless is just actual dread type thing, right? So they'll apply all these things, and then they'll go, I have an understanding of what depression is, and then
Mm.
they'll diagnose it in other people that they know, and it'll be problematic because that's not what depression is. Because in order to understand what depression is, you need to either have experienced it yourself and been told, not always
Sure.
diagnosed, but told that's depression by someone who knows what they're talking about, or you need to have had a lot of experience in observing people with depression and understanding what those terms mean in the context of the DSM.
Well, people get introduced to new language and they're excited to use it.
Yeah, that's
You know
true.
that
That is
that
true.
sounds
I've never thought of
that
that.
sounds simplistic,
Yeah.
but if you give
No, it
someone
is
a
true.
new toolkit, then
Oh my god,
suddenly things are gonna get more pathologized.
that works so
You
much
know.
with philosophy as well. The amount of people that talk
Yeah.
about like
Yeah.
agnosticism and then epistemology and ontology and stuff. Like, and I'm not very
Yeah.
good at philosophy, right? Like I'm still getting to grips with it. Philip and Philip, there's another guy called Dave that talks on Answers and Reason, Harry, and they have
Sure.
conversations, and sometimes I just have no fucking clue what the fuck is going on. I'm just completely lost, right? um, um, but I feel like I'm. The thing is, I'm not willing to use words that I don't understand until I fully understand them. Like epistemology, like I kind of get it now, but I still wouldn't be comfortable necessarily saying it in a sentence because I might get it wrong. And I realized I made a mistake actually on Twitter earlier today because I was talking about the etymology of a word, right? And I said that sandwich, uh, the word sandwich doesn't come from like its etymology isn't based on being between two things, right? Or being a food type.
Right.
It's a place in Kent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
place in Kent, and there was an Earl who was the Earl of the place in Kent, and then he decided to make meat between two slices of bread, and then the sandwich was
Yeah,
bread.
the story is potentially apocryphal, but it is certainly where the name comes from.
so so and I said that that's not, therefore we can't use the etymology of a word in order to say what it means, right? And then he went, well, yeah, but you've shown me the like the way it works through the history, so you're actually arguing that the etymology is important. And then I was like, oh my god, I did do that, because etymology is about the history of the word and how it becomes what it is today, right? What I meant was the etymological root. That's what I should have said. We can't use the etymological root of a word to say what it means today. And
Sure.
so I misspoke, and he picked up on it.
Fair enough.
And then told me off. So, even then, like, I knew what I was trying to say, but I didn't say what I meant to say, and I think that's a big issue.
Mm.
But then still what he was saying was bullshit. So I said, doesn't matter whether I got that wrong, you're still chatting shit.
Well, that sort of ties into the scientism thing quite well, I think, because it's a focus on being accurate over being correct. The idea of that they can, if they can't pick holes in your argument, they're going to pick holes in the way you make it, because it's a closed system for them. They can find flaws in logic rather than flaws in your flaws in the what you're saying.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm trying to draw a line back to the veneration of precision.
Well, yeah, so I guess to one thing that I think I really want to talk about today, and it kind of links back to the stuff around them having learning new words and having like a mild understanding of a field, and then thinking they understand the whole thing, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect in effect. But what I find most interesting is that many of the people that are really hardlines, what would you call them? Because they're not scientists, but it's scientism, so they would be scientists.
Yeah, I don't know. They're probably not.
Scientism.
I'm going to say empiricists, because it's the same thing essentially, right?
Sure.
No, I don't think it necessarily is
Related.
It's related. What can I call them then? Dickheads.
I don't know. I don't know, honestly, right? Because like I would be comfortable calling myself even an empiricist to some extent, right? But it depends on how far you're willing to go with it. I do think, for example, I have no issue saying that science is one of the best, if not actually probably the best way to explore sort of what is true about at least a portion of the universe that we have good observational data on, right? I think there is no better method that we currently possess to sort of explore that part than science. So I don't hate science. Actually, quite the opposite.
No, I don't
a
think any of us
respect,
do.
Yeah.
Let's make that clear
science.
right now. Yeah, let's make that clear right now. I love science. I've conducted science,
Me
right?
too.
So, and I really appreciate the methods. I appreciate the way it works. So, I guess my point is, anyway, and just before I carry on, I just want to say hi to people, because loads of people have suddenly joined. So, hi Icarus, hi Chesh, hi Dave, hi Spartan Theology. Nice to see you all here. So these individuals that venerate science don't understand science. That's a big issue.
I think so. Yeah.
Big issue, because for instance, like, the amount of times I've had to explain what a null hypothesis is, the amount of times I've had to explain that you can prove a negative, and that's what the null hypothesis is, the amount of times I've had to explain that the null hypothesis is falsification, and what falsification is, and also what an experimental design is, and how you what a hypothesis is in general, and how you operationalize that. These layers to think, this is really important stuff when you come into doing scientific research, because people think, oh yeah, the null hypothesis is you don't believe anything. It's essentially skepticism. You don't believe it unless it's proven to be true, and that's kind of true, but it's also not, because you wouldn't be conducting the study if you didn't believe the thing could exist, right? They wouldn't have built like a massive 4 kilometer long laser shooter to measure gravitational waves if they didn't think that gravitational waves could exist. That would be madness if they did that. They're not trying to prove that they don't exist.
Yeah. I think one of the issues as well is with a lot of these people that I've seen, it's not only that they don't understand science, because I mean, to some extent, I understand that, right? Like, it's not necessarily easy to fully grasp science, right? I think that the bigger problem is that they don't understand how much they don't understand about science, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of the bigger thing to me, because it's like there's a lot to it, and a lot can be missed if you're just simplistically brushing over it, and if you're aware of it, right, then you're sort of going to be humble about your conversations surrounding it and stuff like that, right? You're going to be aware that there's a lot that you don't understand, and so you're going to be careful and maybe be more willing to have conversations and be open and listen to people that arguably have better qualifications than you do. But if you just sort of think that you fully understand science, right, then you're just going to go full guns blazing and just you know, have the effect and the impact that we can observe on Twitter when we argue with some of these people. I think that's sort of the bigger issue, and to some extent, this is just sort of describing the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? But I think this is sort of like a big part of the whole thing. At least that annoys me to some extent.
I think it's certainly, yeah, you're right. It's certainly born from that disparity between their opinion of what they know and what they actually know. You know, most people, the last time they engaged in any kind of actual scientific study was probably when they were in, you know, government mandated levels of school. But I think that that's not actually important to them, that they study up on the science itself, because I don't think the pursuit of knowledge, I don't think it's the knowledge that they're after. I think it's the certainty that science provides as an ideal. When you get to these people that are venerating science, it's because they're being given almost like something to, sort of like a justification for their certainty. You know, they want to argue, they want to be right, they want to establish the way the world is, and along comes this system that has, like, oh, it's provable, it's got evidence associated with it, it's got respectable scientific journals backing it up, it's got this whole infrastructure based around verification. And so they see that and they take it and they think, good, I'm going to bolster my opinion of my own conception of the world using the borrowed respectability of science as a field. You know, it's not actually important to them that they know the ins and outs. It's important to them that the ins and outs they profess to know are the correct ones.
Yeah, I think that's very good observation.
I agree with that. And sorry, I just have to address Cheshire's comment.
I can't see chat.
She said, "I'm intimidated and feel threatened by all the beards in this live stream." We're all a bearded heretic. You can only come on if you're a bearded heretic. That's the whole point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
We're a hairy bunch.
And then Icarus says, "I'm an a-bearded heretic. I lack belief in beards." I don't know how. How can you lack belief in beards? Anyway.
I mean, where's the evidence, Luke?
Here?
That's not what he means. He just doesn't think yours can do it.
Oh.
He just doesn't have faith in your beard.
Well, I have faith in my beard. It's how I get my thinking powers. Since I've grown a longer beard, I've become more philosophical. There's a correlation there.
And causation as well.
We
of
all
course.
know correlation. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's because I think more. Because I'm like,
Yeah, it's just natural to think more.
It's little Ariel to let the wisdom in.
Exactly. Yeah. Now I've lost where we were. What were you talking about, Harry? My brain is scatterbrained today. It's a Wednesday. That's why.
I was saying that the people making a big deal about, people who follow scientism, if that's what we're going with, don't really care about being involved in science. They care about being right.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And the thing is, as well, I feel like they make shit up on the spot sometimes. Because, like, just as an example, like, if I ask these people for scientific journals that validate their viewpoint, usually they'll send me a blog post or a YouTube video. And usually that blog post and that YouTube video won't even agree with what they're saying. So it's like they kind of go looking for something once they realize that they've been called out, rather than them having that stuff in their pocket to go, right? So
that's probably the case. They probably picked things up holistically and then thrown them out with certainty. They don't actually have anything ready to back them up.
Yeah. And this is the problem, I think, with documentaries and, like, especially like Netflix documentaries and like non-fiction books that seem really kind of like something like The Secret, for instance, which is about what's the word? Manifesting. Right? Yeah. It's a non-fiction book, so you'd assume it would contain true facts.
I mean, yeah, that assumption is a bit.
I mean,
it's a big assumption, I would say. But
no, but I think no.
Yeah.
But people that aren't critical of.
Oh yeah,
No,
This is what I mean.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
I'm not going to read it and go, oh my god, this is like, I have like books that I get that I note down when I agree or disagree with it in the book, because usually with non-fiction books I don't mind writing in them because it's more like about me trying to form an opinion or an idea, so I need to write notes in order to remember stuff. But that's me being critical of it, and there's things I sometimes I cross out paragraphs because I'm like, this is a load of shit, right? Especially in I can't believe I even got this book, but I did, the Jordan Peterson 12 Rules for Life book. You open that and there's so many paragraphs that I've just crossed out when I was reading it.
You had a period of about a month where that was all you could talk about.
What, that book?
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, it's not got bad advice in it, right? The problem with it is that laced throughout it is a really kind of like ridiculous political message and a really ridiculous religious message, and it kind of gets more toward. It's a bit like the Goop TV series. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
I haven't, but I've heard.
Right. So
it.
So the
Goop,
Gwyneth Paltrow stuff. Yeah. So she has this organization called Goop. It's gotten into a lot of trouble for being problematic in a lot of ways. But she's got a TV show out on Netflix now, and it starts out with like relatively mundane stuff like the massages, and then towards the end it gets into like really weird stuff, like psychokinetic like energy or stuff like that, like stuff that just doesn't exist, right?
Right.
But I think it's the same thing with that Jordan Peterson book. Is the further you go into it, the more he kind of starts to bring up his political messaging and stuff, and it's like, that's the problem. And the more there was a bunch of people, this is the problem as well with like public figures, is that if somebody is a threat to someone, a lot of the time they attack them, and then that person, when they defend themselves appropriately, makes themselves seem more valid. and Jordan Peterson was very good at defending himself against some of the attacks were completely out of left field, like they weren't relevant to anything that he's ever said, and he was able to defend
Yeah.
that and go, I've never said anything like that, and it was true. And then that makes him more valid, and the people who are criticizing him less valid because they're criticizing him on grounds that aren't right. But then when you actually look
Yeah.
into Jordan Peterson's arguments and then you start to pick it apart, they fall apart really quickly. And if they actually had the right scrutiny, people would be aware of that a lot sooner. But because people are saying the wrong arguments, it ends up that he actually seems like he's got a valid opinion and he's the one winning these fights, and it's ridiculous.
Well, that's how they that's why all those sort of they do tend to be right wing political commentators mostly. Your Steven Crowders and your Ben Shapiro types. But like that that phenomenon is what they're courting when they always go to college campuses. They go to like university campuses and say, anybody want to debate me on this thing or that thing? And it's like, yeah, it's a grown ass man whose entire livelihood is based on the things he's arguing, trying to start debates with random college students who are unprepared, and then when the debate inevitably goes towards the person who is more prepared, they're able to then wave that victory in everyone's faces and like add it to their pile and say, see, look how right I am. It's that same method.
Exactly, yeah. And
yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think and sorry, go on, Philip.
Yeah, no, I just never considered this like as an actual strategy, but I think it's brilliant to some extent, right? Because it like the publicity gets done for you to some extent, right? Like you just go there and you know for a fact you pick strategically the places where you know that the outcome is going to be overwhelmingly in your favor. And then you don't have to do anything really, right? Because then you can just and then it's easy for you because then you can just group everyone that disagrees with you as if they were the same sort of types of people that you already sort of won against, right? So then it becomes really easy to group them all together and just say, oh yeah, they've tried so many times already, right? But they always failed because you strategically never placed yourself in the positions to be actually confronted with the people that have sort of substantive criticism of you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if you look at, I mean, Jordan Peterson is a great example because the advice that he gives is not the advice that a modern day practicing clinical psychologist should give. He gives the right advice, but not advice from a clinical psychologist. If I got advice like that from a clinical psychologist, I'd be like fucking so disappointed. His understanding of is old school. He's an old school clinical psychologist. He bases all of his practices off of Jung's work.
Right? I was gonna say he's Jungian, isn't he?
And that's like saying, oh, I follow a purely Darwinistic view of evolution. I don't care for all this modern DNA stuff. I don't care for any of this modern these model fossil records. I'm only going to go by the finding of the birds that he found. That's my basis for evolution. Right? And it's stupid because it's old. It's so old, and it doesn't make. And the problem with Jung as well is that he was very mythological with the way that he described things, and he talks about stories and archetypes and stuff like that, and that has almost nothing to do with modern day psychological practice. That's really
Jordan Peterson is very into the he's very into the soul of a people thing from Jung, the character of a people.
Yeah.
Anyway,
let's get off of Jordan Peterson.
So I just really like the idea of rejecting modern. Like, I don't care about your DNA analysis. Show me the chaffinches.
Exactly. Things have moved on. Get with the times. We don't need to use 100-year-old research. We have modern day research.
But stuff like that gets gets stuck in people's heads. You know, think about like sticking with psychology, think about the whole ego, superego, and id thing. That's been raised to the level of that's practically been raised to the level of like mythology. It's like it's just a thing that everybody thinks like that everybody hears, and it starts getting thrown about really easily. It's like, but it might as well be an old wives' tale. It's
Do you know?
it's not.
Sorry.
Like you say, it's not modern science anymore. It may not have been entirely disproven, but it's certainly been refined to the point where it's unrecognizable. But you'll still hear people basing judgments about entire people on this.
Do you want to know who the worst offenders for this whole thing is, though? For this not understanding psychology and not modernizing psychology. Fucking artists. Oh my goodness. They love Freud. They love Jung. They just want to insert him into and that was an intended like kind of pun, into everything. If they can get a Freudian mother-son Oedipus complex in a story, perfect. If they can get some Jungian archetypes in there, perfect. It's so annoying because if all the art people see, so like movies, TV shows, songs, plays, theatre, if all of it contains these kind of like Freudian and Jungian ideas, people will think that's all psychology is. And this is why we still have this kind of weird concept that psychology is a pseudoscience, because people just think it's a bunch of people just analysing people's dreams and talking to them at the top of a fucking chaise lounge.
Lay on the sofa and tell me what you feel. Yeah, people don't have. Yeah, so these ideas get stuck in people's heads. They have like a snappy conception of what a field of science looks like, and as long as it fits the structure that they already have in their head, we all get introduced to this stuff when we're kids, basically through media and all that sort of thing, mostly through, like you say, fictional storytelling, and then when we grow up and we go out into the world and we encounter this stuff, we try and find the pieces of it that suit our preconceived idea. We don't, obviously, not everybody, but most people, I feel, probably don't seek to update that and would resist it being updated. If you try to correct somebody on like Oedipal complexes, they'd be like, don't be silly, everyone knows about blank.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is accurate in so many things.
And then what we have is people labeling themselves critical thinkers and skeptics. Right, I remembered the other thing that I was going to say, the number 2 thing I was going to say.
We're getting back around.
Yeah, it's about right. So people are willing to believe facts, right? They'll believe facts about the world, okay? Having not conducted any research into it themselves. And by not conducting research, I mean not just reading research papers, but actually doing the research. So when it comes down to criticizing a research paper, because, you can pull some papers, absolutely tear them to shit, right? You can absolutely look through it and be like, there's so many issues with this. They aren't able to do that. Like, I feel like I could read a research paper by psychology and be like, this psychologist didn't have enough participants. They used an invalid measure. They used an unreliable kind of like whatever, structure. And I could tear it apart quite easily and then say this would be a better approach. But I feel like if it's peer reviewed and it's in a journal, so many people will just be like, yeah, it's true.
Well, I mean, what you're describing sounds like a lot of work, Luke. And if I'm honest, I'm just trying to get in a Twitter argument. So
That's exactly it. That's exactly what the approach is, And I'm not saying that everyone like needs to go and read every paper that's ever been published, right? Obviously, that's impossible, right? But if you're gonna talk about a certain subject as if you kind of understand it to a really like complex level, you need to be able to understand and unpick the issues with the field, right? So when people are talking about like and I know that I've changed my mind on this argument, Philip, but let me have this one. So if we're talking about free
Yeah,
will
sure.
and we're using MRI scans as a way of saying we don't have free will because our unconscious makes decisions before our conscious mind is aware of the decision. We need to understand that the MRI is one, not very reliable. Two, not reliable. It's not very valid because it's not very spatially sensitive. So an fMRI I'm talking about. So it's kind of averages of averages. So you get loads of people to just be lying in it to see what the average brain thing is, and then you get a couple people into the MRI, and then scan their brains and see what the differences are. Right. So that's how it works. So
I'm sorry, you've lost me. How is that related to free will?
So okay, so there's a study that came out a while ago that was talking about free will and how people make unconscious decisions before they're conscious. So people aren't aware of the decisions they're making. But they think they are aware of them. So if you were to if I had a red button and I said you can either hit this red button with your left hand or your right hand, right? And then you have to consciously decide. Yeah, your unconscious would have made that decision prior to you becoming aware of it, and then you'd hear it with your left hand or your right hand, right?
Sure.
And the way that they measured that was by measuring what part of the brain you're using in order to make that decision, right? So
I see.
So
Sure.
if it's
Okay.
if it's like subcortical, then it's likely to be unconscious, and I know that's an unconscious area of the brain. Okay, but there's issues with the studies in that they they aren't fMRIs aren't very valid because of the way that they work. So it's about like kind of like they take a bunch of averages and then they compare your result to the average. Yeah. So the pathways will be slightly different for everyone. But the other issue is that they were only testing simple choices. So they weren't testing like buying a house, for instance, which takes a little bit more consideration because you're making an actual life choice rather than just pushing a button. And also it takes more kind of like cognitive exertion because there's more factors to consider, right? So there's limitations in the study. Now I don't know if complex decisions will have the same effect, right? But for people to say that this study proves it shows that they don't understand how to pick apart that study, because if they did, then they'd realize that all it proves is that simple decisions you make unconsciously before they're conscious.
Yeah, although I think that, to be fair, a lot of people feel that the decisions that are truly free are those like types of simple decisions, right? Like if you say, choose between, like a lot of people will say when they talk about free will, oh, I can freely choose to pick up the glass from the table, right? Or put it down again, right? That this is like sort of the most intuitive way that people picture free will, right? Like you have a glass and then you can freely choose whether or not to pick it up. So I think it makes some sort of sense to study these types of decisions, which are like sort of simple as pressing a button, right? Because for a lot of people, they feel like that's like the freest choice that you could possibly make, right? I'm totally free whether or not I press the button or not. When it comes to actual considerations, right? I think a lot of people would say, well, yeah, but I'm thinking about this, right? And I'm influenced by other sort of external factors when I'm trying to decide, whether or not to move out of this house or not. So I think they would sort of be more likely to say that those types of decisions are sort of not as free because they are sort of influenced by all these factors that are external to them. But sort of like these very simple decisions, they would sort of say that, oh, these are the ones where I'm actually free in my actions. So yeah, I think at least that's how I would I guess see why they picked these types of scenarios.
I think it's a limitation of the technology we have as well.
Oh yeah, that is a fair concern.
So yeah, people are unable to pick apart these kinds of studies
Hmm.
because they don't have the training, they don't have the experience within not just field specific experience, but they don't have any kind of like uh, critical thinking training that they could then apply to how the structure of a study might be carried out, or how the results might be being interpreted differently by different people,
Yeah.
or the myriad reasons why a study might not be as valid as another.
And this is why meta-analyses are so much better than just individual studies, because I could find a study that says basically anything, because there's going to be studies that are non-significant, right? And there's going to be studies that have significant results for because all the significance rating is, which is usually so significance rating is usually the basis of whether something is true or false, right? In a study. So if something is, if there's a significant difference or a significant effect between X and Y, then that effect exists, right? And if there's not a significant difference between X and Y, then that effect doesn't exist. That's the idea, yeah?
Hmm.
But significance is just about how sure we are that it's not down to chance. So if you're 95% convinced or 95% sure that it's not down to chance, there's still that 5% room for error. Yeah, and so that's why meta-analyses are better, because in an individual study, I could find a significant result that is an error, due to like kind of maybe the population I used or anything like that. But um, I could, if there's multiple studies that are testing the same thing, and I look at all of them, then I'm going to find out what's more likely to be true, because most of them should not have that error, and that one might have it, but that's fine. That's an outlier. We can exclude that one.
Yeah.
So people should start looking at meta-analyses, and people should start doing meta-analyses better as well.
Yeah, but when you're talking about the average person, you would have to start that encouragement with an explanation of what a meta-analysis is. I think it becomes an issue then about science communication. People need to be people do have a much higher base level of understanding about a lot of these
Yeah.
things than their parents did, but that still needs to be um well, actually, no, I was going to say it needed to be elevated further, but I'm not sure if that's specifically what I mean. I don't mean that people need to be more generally knowledgeable about science. I mean that people need to be
Better critical thinkers.
um, yeah, that too, but like I guess what I'm saying is they need to be educated in how to apply the knowledge that they've learned.
Which is where
Because it's not.
philosophy comes in, because that's not a scientific
Well,
question,
sure.
right? That's not a scientific
Yeah,
question. You
sure.
can't, and this is the problem. They don't ask that question. They don't ask the question of how can I apply this, because the application isn't scientific. This is the problem I had. I brought this up in a Twitter argument, and Three Vikings, I think, had a bit of a disagreement with me, because I was saying that we ought to consider ethical um, approaches prior to a discovery. So, for instance, when we were because you don't we didn't discover the atom, the splitting of the atom by accident. That's what we were trying to do, and we had an understanding of what might happen if we split the atom, how much energy would be created, because that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to create an energy source, right? They should have said, if we do discover how to split the atom, and this is correct, how are we going to apply this? Well, there should be an agreement that we cannot use this to make weapons. That's really hard
Sure. Yeah.
politically. That's really hard.
Those kinds of conversations ought to be had. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there should be states should agree unilaterally. Okay, we're gonna find out this new we're coming up to discovering fusion properly, right? Probably. There should be discussions around that and say, look, we're not gonna make a fusion bomb. Because Because that could be potentially worse. I don't know. I don't know how fusion works. Could it be potentially worse?
I
Uh,
I don't know. I have a very limited understanding of fusion, but
not
from what,
really.
yeah, but from what I know, it's not as it's not as applicable to weapons.
Is it just
let's
less
say.
radioactive? Is that the benefit of it?
No, it's the kind of methods to generate a fusion reaction that we would be likely to have access to in the next couple of decades, wouldn't be like we couldn't create a fusion reaction that would be unstable enough to be used as a area of effect weapon. You know, part of the thing that makes a fission bomb so dangerous is that once it happens, it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Whereas fusion needs to be like pretty intense. Like the effort made to create a fusion reaction in the first place is pretty intense. You couldn't really fit that into that wouldn't be applicable as a
my only understanding
weapon.
of fusion comes from Spider-Man 2. So
Fair enough.
So all I know
Hey
is
man,
we need a Neuralink.
Power of the sun in the palm of your hand.
We need a Neuralink set of robotic arms to contain it. That's all I know. To contain the power of the sun. I've forgotten what I was saying again. That's
that ethical considerations should be prior to scientific discoveries. Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. I don't know exactly what I think about that. But it's a very... Yeah, go ahead.
No, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was finished. That's
and I got this. I didn't get this idea just out my own brain. Like this is discussed in Julian Baggini's "How the World Thinks," like the first part of that book, where he discusses the fact that if we just carry on down this very empiricist scientism following route that society seems to be following, eventually it's going to lead to the destruction of us as a race, as a species, or even the destruction of the world and lots of other species with us, because we're not putting ethical checks in place prior to understanding the power that we have with those scientific discoveries. And global warming is a big example of that, because it's not just like these very explosive kind of like something like the nuclear bomb. It's also stuff like coal power and like gas power and factory farming and all these other things that we've developed through scientific methods that are having a detriment to the planet and are going to potentially have a detriment to us permanently.
I think the problem with that is that humans are very bad at seeing the future. Like,
yeah, you're not wrong.
Not in like what I mean is that we're not good at envisioning a future that is based on the knowledge that we have without mixing in the things we want and the things like sort of emotional reactions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you created a new technology and then held a discussion on how it could be ethically applied, and you said, well, it could be applied badly, there will be a fair amount of people who will think, yeah, but maybe it won't, or there'll be a couple of people who will want that because they want it as a weapon or whatever you have, or what have you. And there will be some people who are they're just plain, they're so focused on what it can provide for people that they're not willing to entertain reasonably the risks involved. I think if you did come up with, for example, like a fusion generator, people would be so focused on the potential benefits that they might skate over the negatives in a way that would end up being harmful and could have been predicted, but we're in the face of like an energy crisis. The benefits of progress become so shiny that we can't help but reach for them. I think if you tried to put those kinds of ethical brakes on something before we saw the consequences, like saw it for ourselves, I think you'd have a very, very difficult time of putting any of that stuff into any kind of restrictions into place that would end up being significant. You know.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think we. Yeah, first of all, I think there's an open question right here about sort of having the information available, right? Doing the research, having the information, and then sort of thinking about how to apply that or to stop it before the sort of research even happens, right? Because I think to some extent, if you're arguing that science should be sort of monitored, I guess, by ethics or something like that, are you arguing for this idea that you shouldn't do the research if it has potential to harm things, or are you sort of arguing that you do the research anyway, but before we do the research, let's talk about, the possible outcomes and their possible consequences, and then sort of have an agreement about how we're going to go with the results depending on how the research goes, right? Because there are many different ways that you could approach this sort of ethics and science sort of mix up, I guess. And depending on which one of those you're going to go with, I personally might agree or disagree with you. But I think it's correct to say that we as humans are pretty bad at sort of I mean, we're gonna tinker with stuff until we see, oh, this is bad, and then we're gonna stop, presumably, right? It's very hard for you to really convince yourself of how bad the thing actually is.
Yeah.
If you're just sort of imagining it. So I think it's.
I guess
hard.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think that I'm not saying we should halt science or halt scientific research or anything like that in order to put ethical considerations in place, because I think progress is important. I do think that we need to make progress in lots of areas and stuff. Like, for instance, your energy point is really fair. I guess what I would like to see, at the very least, is ethics taught with science at any stage. Like, even from like secondary school stage, like 16, 17, 18, those kind of ages, ethics should be one of the fundamental things that should be taught. We shouldn't just be taught science and that's it. Because then you're at least considering it. Because for me, when I was at uni, we were taught about, all these unethical studies and stuff, and we had to make sure that our we had ethical guidelines that we had to follow, and we had to make sure that our studies passed those ethical guidelines on an ethics board and stuff. However, it wasn't really taught to us the value of that or why that's in place or anything like that. And I think that in things like physics and stuff like that, maybe it's not taught at all, except for maybe a few different strands of it. So I think that that's probably the approach that we should take at the very least, is saying, look, you can do your science, but you need to know ethics as well.
To be honest, we could do. Well, to be honest, I think we could do with teaching ethics at any stage in
For anything.
compulsory education without being sought out. Because at the moment, the only time you encounter ethics and philosophy outside of a religious context is if you seek it out specifically as a choice. You never went into a philosophy class, did you, Luke?
No.
Because you never had to. The closest you got was like religion. Sure. I mean, like the closest you got was like religious education, maybe, or like a citizenship class.
Yeah.
But they were pretty. But like one is very firmly through the lens of whatever religion you're studying, and the other is pretty half-assed and terribly underfunded. So, like, frankly, introducing any level of ethical consideration would be great.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and say that we should just teach philosophy at every level of compulsory education.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I mean, ethics is a subset of philosophy, and I think it deserves its own sort of thing. But like philosophy is a big sort of thing for me, because I do think that like all of these questions that we analyze to some extent, right? About reasoning itself and about how to analyze studies even. I mean, that could be taught in a scientific class as well. I think it's perfectly appropriate. But there are a lot of sort of more general ways of looking at thinking in general, how thinking works. That is so deeply missing from our educational system. It's like it hurts. It hurts to see that there's a lot of information out there that we have about how thinking works, and we should be teaching that stuff, because that's the information that's going to allow you to have this transversal sort of understanding of things, right? Of applying. Oh, this is like an inductive principle that is being used here, right? And it's being used here as well, and that understanding is empowering, right? Because then you can actually understand the mechanism of how different ways of understanding our world sort of exist and how they work, and that's very helpful in my opinion, and much more so to some extent, at least, than I'm saying to some extent a lot, anti, but whatever. I'm trying. I think the point is that if you just teach, what the scientific discoveries that we have made are, it's going to be much less effective at actually teaching you how to think in a scientific way, or even sort of like more broadly in a logical way. Like, a lot of people don't know what logic is if you ask them, right? Like, they're going to say intuitively, oh, this is logical, right? Or this is not logical. But if you actually ask them what is logic, they won't be able to answer you. Like, I mean, maybe if they've gone through computer science, they're going to have some rudimentals, right? But they're not going to be able to understand how that applies to thinking, right? Or how that applies to arguments, because that's sort of like more in a different sense. Although they share some common ground. So it's this. I think this information is very helpful, and it should be out there, and it should be in everyone's minds, I think, to some extent. No, I'm not going to say that again. Sorry. Yeah, I'm very confused tonight.
Of the way through it.
Yeah. Yeah, almost. But yeah, I think this is very bottom line. I think this is very important, and this should be sort of known.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know that Bill Nye doesn't understand Descartes? There's there was an interview a little while ago with Bill Nye the Science Guy, and it was basically him. It was essentially him trying to trash on the concept of studying philosophy. Yeah. He said, all this stuff about I think, therefore I am. What if you stop thinking about it? Are you going to disappear?
Oh.
I think you'd still exist. And it,
yeah, that hurts. That hurts.
There are many things that are troubling about that. First of all, clearly he doesn't know what that is. But also that he's a very effective science communicator. He himself isn't a scientist. He was a comedian, but he was a very effective science communicator. And there are whole sections of the population, especially in the States, where he was like their introduction to big sections of scientific interest. So when he like puts forward his opinion on this sort of thing, people are going to listen, even though he doesn't know what he's talking about, and even though he has clearly been emboldened to talk about it, even though he doesn't know what he's talking about. There are still people that are going to pay attention to what he's saying, and people that are going to reinforce his confidence on that by agreeing with him.
Yeah.
Well,
because he's been reliable in the past.
It's very popular to trash philosophy, unfortunately.
Yeah, especially by the new atheist types.
Exactly.
Like Richard Dawkins, etc. Like those, and I have special beef with Richard Dawkins right now because he's an absolute knob end. But they're all that. What they were trying to do was get people into scientific thinking and then use science to justify atheism, for that was the New
Right.
Scientist movement, right? New Scientist. That's a magazine. New Atheist movement.
New atheist.
Sorry, Gregory Buttocks has just said, "Love the fact that this channel is called Bearded Heretic, and the panel has 3 different stages of beard growth." There's so many comments about the beards today. Thank you. And I will get to your question. Don't you worry.
That's also a great name, though. To be fair,
Gregory Buttocks. He joined one of our streams before, and I think I had a giggle at it. He said, "Don't laugh. That's my actual name." And then he said he was German or
that's
something.
even better.
But but I
That's
can't
fair.
believe that's not fake. I can't believe that's not fake.
Oh no, that's. We went to school with a shuffle bottom.
We did go to school with a shuffle bottom. Yeah.
Some silly names out there, man.
Anyway,
Sorry, go on.
so the New Atheist movement was pushing this science view and pushing this, and I think it's still very much like present in like the atheist zeitgeist of like science is the be all and end all. Evolution disproves God. This the fact that it's the geocentric model, no, the heliocentric model disproves God. The stuff like that, like it's like madness, and it's like if you actually think about it, like this is the thing as well, like people say, oh, prayer's not effective, therefore God doesn't exist, and they use studies about prayer and its effectiveness in order to show that God doesn't exist. And then like any good scientist would say, well, no, that just proves that prayer doesn't work. That doesn't prove God doesn't exist, right?
And it's sort of, and again, it's sort of fundamentally missing the point.
How so?
That's well, it's prayer's a social mechanic. Prayer's it's something used in a group to what?
Sorry, Gregory Rotic said, yes, sir, that's my real name. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. Let's just say I was the butt of a lot of jokes in school, pun intended. Thank you for having a sense of humour, Gregory. I appreciate it. You're welcome back anytime.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on, Harry.
Prayer has all the benefits of religious ritual. It's a collective sharing of want and will, but then on top of that, you're then encouraged to go home and do it in the private, which ends up being, I reckon you take your average workaday Christian, and prayer will be their most contemplative moment of the day. I think prayer as a practice has survived because it's a useful
I don't disagree with that. I think
aspect of that structure. But more importantly, the people who were trying to prove that prayer didn't work didn't think about a single word that I just said.
Yeah.
They were thinking of it as like a wish. They were and like, well, I prayed for a motorbike and I didn't get a motorbike, so therefore, it's a disingenuous argument, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and there's a whole reason that they say God works in mysterious ways, because that's the problem with even religious people who pray. They're like, my prayer wasn't answered in the way that I thought it would be.
Yeah.
So if we saw a clear cut, even religious people don't see a clear cut response to prayer. Like,
yeah, that's my point. Like, I appreciate this way of thinking. I think it's actually a very good sort of approach to prayer. But I do think that a lot of Christians, especially maybe we're affected by our culture as well, right? It's sort of a European culture. I mean, not anymore for you guys, but yeah. But I mean, what I mean is that in the United States, right, things are a bit different, and I think this is my intuition, at least, that if you would poll Christians in America, in the United States, they would probably sort of have a different view on prayer than what was outlined here, right? They would probably think that wishing, that they would see it more like a wish, essentially, that is probably being granted, at least just in certain settings, or if you pray hard enough, or if it's in God's will. And of course, I mean, many would say that not all prayers get answered, but I think it's still they would still see it as a useful practice, because they think that a lot of, or at least the majority maybe of prayers get answered and stuff like that. So I do think that while I appreciate that there are these other views on prayer, I think it still makes sense to maybe test, if not prayer sort of as a whole, and in every possible interpretation, at least prayer in this particular sort of branch, which is arguably popular, to test that sort of idea of prayer. And maybe in that context, it would make sense to say then that that it doesn't. I'm not exactly familiar with the study, so I'm not sure if Luke wants to.
There's various studies. It's just about like kind of a double-blind situation where people weren't aware whether they were being prayed for or not, and people prayed for them and stuff like that, and then see what they got. But basically,
I think you see that a lot at the moment with when there's a disaster. When something terrible happens, and people on social media will, they'll say something, "I'm praying for you," that sort of thing. This person is sick, include them in your prayers tonight, that sort of thing. And I've seen a lot of atheists. I've seen a lot of this sort of like new atheist thing jumping onto those responses and saying, well, that's not going to do any good. And it's like, regardless of whether or not you think it's going to heal the sick person, that is like, if you think about it from the praying person's perspective, they think it's working. So they're telling you that they're gonna go and entreat with what they think is the highest power in the universe on your behalf. So like, regardless of whether or not you think it's gonna help anything in a material sense, that's still like a very nice thing to do.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and do you know what I've heard recently, right? One of the responses to Answers and Reasons 10 Questions for Atheists stream, was, oh yeah, I won't say I'm praying for you, but I'll say something like I'm thinking of you. Which is exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And it is nice, and that's the point, right? If somebody says they're praying for me, what I'm hearing for my benefit is that they have me in their thoughts, which is nice. It's nice that people are worrying about me and caring about me, right? If they said that, and that's fine. I'm happy with that. I don't need, like, as long as I'm getting medical attention, I don't need people coming in and bringing me lots of stuff and like making a fuss of me. But it's nice to know that people are thinking of me and making sure that they're concerned, essentially, which is how I see it. So yeah. But yeah, I agree with you, Harry, as well. If they think they're doing something good, then what's the harm? There isn't any harm there. So why do we need to criticize it that much? It's when it comes to faith healing, there's layers, isn't there? If it's faith healing, people with like severe illnesses, that's dangerous. Yeah, that should be scout. That should be told off. I don't know how. To, I've lost all my words.
Particularly
that should be criticised. There we go.
Well, particularly when those sorts of avenues of faith start to be manipulated for profit, and when they start to like become the basis of these, like I say, faith healing is essentially a scam. It's these people, they're like targeting the vulnerable, and it like like obviously there are points at which these things become dangerous, but yeah, I think it comes from this scientism base. It comes from this extreme empiricist tendency to attack what doesn't fit
And what
their structure.
and just before we can carry on, actually, because I want to plug Miracle by Darren Brown, because it's a fantastic show and really gets to the depths of that faith healing stuff and really criticizes it in an entertaining way. And also, if you
Sure.
guys watch the version recorded live that was on Channel 4 a while ago, but I'm sure you can find it somewhere else. It was on Netflix as well, I think, actually. I'm in the audience. You can see me for like 2 seconds in it. So if you find me, screenshot it, and tweet it to me, because I'd be funny to see if you can find me, because I look very different. Um, so anyway, the problem, the next layer of that is apathy and becoming quite cold. Like, I find that when people get this real scientism kind of like perspective on the world, they then start to say, well, if we can't prove, I don't know, they become quite cold with their approaches to things, like death, for instance. They'll say things like, oh yeah, I just kind of got over it because I realized that it's this part of our life cycle, and everyone's going to die, and there's no essence left in that person anywhere, because they didn't have a soul or anything, so it's just their body, and that's fine. And it's like, there are emotions there which are empirically verified, and you ought to feel them, because suppressing them like that is dangerous. And I find that people tend to do that when they're kind of led down this like kind of empiricist route, because they almost want to become like Spock, the most logical, like kind of like scientific person.
Please don't say logical, but okay.
I'm saying they want to become the most logical, kind of empirically valid version of a human, right? But they're failing because they're not
driven by reason.
Driven by reason, yeah. But they're failing
Yeah.
because then they're not allowing themselves to experience the very human, very kind of like innate emotions that we have, which are there to protect us, and they're
beneficial.
Yeah, exactly. We evolved with them. They have uses, and it's very difficult to then try and reason with that person to be like, these are important. All the psychological research suggests that these are important. This is how you should cope with grief. And then they're like, yeah, I can just reason my way out of it. It's like, no, that's not how our brains work. Why are you doing this?
And I think you'll notice as well that those people who become very cold often end up, hurting other people's feelings, and then dismissing the hurt that they've done because, well, you should just be cold like me. It's a very good excuse to ignore how your actions affect others. Like, yeah, your dad might not have had a soul, and when you're at the funeral. Sorry, I don't mean your dad.
That's okay. You can mean my dad. I don't mind. He didn't have a soul.
No, when you're at wait, sorry, I
can make
derailed myself.
Now. Yeah,
I derailed myself there. Yeah, when you're at a funeral, the person who died might not have had a soul, and they might be cold in the ground, and you might believe all that. And on a purely scientific level, you could very well be right. But that's probably not what the family wants to hear. And espousing those kinds of viewpoints probably isn't going to help anyone in your immediate vicinity, which is more realistically what you should be concerned with as a human in a situation with other humans.
Yeah, and this is a really good segue for me to plug my most recent stream, which is about grief and atheism, which is a follow-on from Shannon Q's stream. So, which is exactly what you're talking about, Harry. So it's not just me plugging it for the sake of it; it's actually relevant. Where I discuss all of those things. So, yeah, exactly. That's the thing, though. Especially, like, I think around grieving, we should be respecting other people's beliefs at the utmost, because
regardless,
usually that's the kind of whole the foundation of it is around those fears. There are some points and some questions in the chat. So, are you guys ready for some?
Yes.
I'm going to go from the bottom up because the bottom ones are the most relevant ones. So, Brina says, from an American viewpoint, well, she says American viewpoint incoming, because we know how brash the Americans like to be. Just insert their viewpoint wherever they want to insert it. How rude. It's also highly criticized in the States. So talking about the praying stuff, because you often hear thoughts and prayers in the face of tragedies instead of any actual beneficial policy or change. I guess that that's especially kind of relating to like school shootings and stuff, where you'll hear like we're praying for the people who are bereaved, but then they don't make any changes to gun laws or anything like that. So
yeah, I think once that sort of thing starts to be the standard response of those who do actually have some power over it,
yeah,
again, that's when it starts to become dangerous.
yeah. And then Chesh gives an example off the top of her head. She says, like a grieving widow, everyone saying, "Let us know if you need anything. We'll pray for you." Then no one helps her when she asks for help with mundane chores.
Mm.
And then Brina says, a lot of time prayer becomes a way to feel like they've helped without actually helping, which is a problem in the face of a lot of struggles people face. Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that I don't think that's exclusive to religious people. I think that non-religious people and atheists as well will say things like "I'm thinking of you" with no intention of actually helping out. I think that what they want to do is make themselves feel better without having to do hard work. The amount of times, like when my dad passed away, there was a few people who said, "If you need anything, you know, come to me" and stuff. And kind of when I did approach those people, they were a bit hesitant with it. They didn't really want to engage with it, and they weren't particularly religious, because no one really is. None of my friends really are in the UK. So there's quite a few that I do have that are religious, but not many. So yeah, I think that that's not necessarily exclusive. It's just maybe the language is different. But that's just problematic in general. People, if they want to help, they should help usefully. But it is also useful to have known people are around.
Yeah, I wonder if there's oh well, obviously it comes from this feeling of wanting to express sympathy without going so far as to offer material help, because maybe you're not able to, maybe you don't want to, maybe the tragedy is too removed from you to really warrant it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah, maybe language needs to evolve around that.
Like, how many people watch children in need and then don't donate? I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know what the figures are, but that would be an interesting thing to look at, wouldn't it?
Mm.
There is a question from Gregory Buttocks. I have to say your full name. I cannot say anything. I hope. Right, Gregory, you are always welcome here. And he says he's extremely theistic. He's extremely religious. So you're always welcome here. Don't worry. But I will have to say your full name every time I discuss you. So apologies for that, but I'm sure you understand. So he asks, in your opinion, how does religion intersperse with science? And according to you, are they two interdependent? Interdependent. Are the two interdependent? Religion and science.
Are the two interdependent, or are they two interdependent?
It says, are they two interdependent, but that doesn't make sense to me.
They TOO?
TWO.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so are the two
Are
independent
the
is probably
two
more likely.
interdependent, yeah. In your opinion, how does religion intersperse with science? And according to you, are the two interdependent?
That's a good question. I mean, we have different viewpoints from both sides of the coin in this discussion, so it's going to be interesting.
Sure.
What are your thoughts, Harry? I'm still trying to process that question.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about it too.
Say the first bit again.
In your opinion, how does religion intersperse with science? And according to you,
I see.
are
Right.
the two interdependent?
I've actually thought about this a lot. And how I've come to think of it is I've sort of come to think of science as religion 2.0, in that not in the fervor of the people who follow it necessarily, because as we say, that's the problem we're having with scientism, but in that many religious beliefs initially were developed as ways to fill in the gaps about the things we didn't know about the world. You know, we exist in a big shadowed area of mystery, and then we start to fill in the gaps with what we do know with mythology. We tell stories. That's what humans do. We hear thunder, we don't know how to describe it, so we say, "Oh, it's God banging a drum." So for the longest time, we'll stick with some variation on God banging a drum. It's angels bowling. It's a big anvil, whatever. And then eventually, somebody will figure out what thunder is, how it works. And that information will get more granular and will actually come down to the science of, yes, this is what thunder is. And then we'll replace the mythologized version with the new version. It's sort of, yeah, I think of religion as a less methodical attempt to understand the things we don't understand. So then when science comes along, it replaces it. It pushes it out the way because we don't need the old explanation anymore. It gets used somewhere else. It gets stacked up with the rest of the ritual. And we have science, this new kind of methodical system of understanding. But we can't deny that while it is replacing it, that while science is replacing religion in the way that we understand the world, we still have the remnants of religious belief in our thinking everywhere we go. It's been such a powerful influence throughout history that we can't just get rid of it. There is still a part of us that thinks, you know, black cats are unlucky or whatever. We still have this tendency to hold on to non-scientific thinking. So I don't think you're ever going to be able to have one without the other. You're never going to be able to extricate story and mythologized thinking from how we attempt to understand the world. What you need to do instead is appropriately compartmentalize those things alongside their origin and their original usage and how we benefited from that usage, and then compare it and kind of establish the new way of doing things, the scientific way of doing things. Science is like you said in the beginning, Philip, it's the best method we have for understanding the universe, and any new system of understanding the universe will likely be born out of the science we use today.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we're never going to get rid of religious thinking, and nor do I think necessarily that we should, but we do need to recognize what it's good for, what it's not good for, and not to let it leak into science where it wouldn't be helpful. But I think trying to keep them totally cleanly separate is probably not very helpful, and more importantly, is probably not necessarily possible. But using, appropriate differentiation between the two is massively important.
Interesting. I think I
Yeah, that's
agree.
incredibly interesting answer.
Yeah.
Coming from a theist, I wouldn't expect that at all. That was very, very insightful.
Well, he's a deist, so
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, okay.
So, um, I think I agree with most of what you said, Harry. The one thing I would disagree with is the point at which religion became an institution. I think it became
Hmm.
a a social tool rather than a tool for finding out information. People took those concepts and then used them to exert power, historically speaking. And I think that is probably the difference for me, because I think religious beliefs are fine provided that um, they're not harmful to others. I don't have a problem with people believing in whatever they want to believe as long as they don't harm other people. And institutions, I think, religious institutions do have a habit of um, exerting their force on other people in some way, especially fundamentalist and evangelical institutions. Um, and they will actively deny that aspect of the science in order to do that. So, for instance, if we find out something about about I don't know, evolution or something, that's a really easy example because it's something that young Earth creationist churches actively deny. Um, they'll use their doctrine in order to deny the science, and so it's transformed from um uh this thing to explain what the thunder is, and you use mythology to explain it, into a system of power.
Hmm.
Um, and that's where like as soon as that happened, or that happens within an individual or a group of individuals, I think that's where the cut off between the link is. And at that point, they're exclusive. They're independent of each other. Whilst it is somebody trying to explain the world through what they know about, like religious texts and stuff, doctrine, that's when they're kind of like more closely linked, in my opinion, because it is still that kind of like inductive, trying to figure out what's going on, why does the world the way the world is, trying to understand morality, trying to understand stuff like that, and
Hmm.
we do that. Well, that would be more philosophy, but philosophy and science are closely linked, I think, more so, in that way of like trying to understand what the world is. So yeah, I think I agree with pretty much everything you said, except for the fact that as soon as it becomes an institution, and as soon as it becomes a social construct in order to exert power and influence and make decisions politically, that's where it becomes a completely independent kind of like um, thing from science, in my opinion.
Hmm.
It's kind of at that point it's less like a tool, because I think religion or theistic views can be used as a tool, and more like um, yeah, a social power play.
It's become opaque at that point.
Yeah, yeah, and rigid and yeah, unmoving. Philip, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I guess. Wait a minute. The
Do you want
question.
me to read
I
it
want to
again?
word it correctly. Yeah. How it. Okay, yeah. Like, my confusion stems from the fact that I don't know what. I mean, I don't know if there should be a relationship in the first place. Like, okay, I guess that historically you could say that religions, had some explanatory role in society, right? They sort of tried to explain how the world is, and to some extent they still do um, today. But and you could see that yes, science is sort of replacing a lot of what seemed to be a lot of stuff that religions taught throughout the years, at least is getting sort of shifted into a more metaphorical sphere because of science and the explanatory power of science, which is arguably great. But I don't know exactly how this is supposed to play out in the future, because maybe the easiest thing to say here is that I don't think religions or religion should ever get in conflict with science. I think if you get to that point, you lose. I think that's a very dangerous place to be if you're a religious person, and you think that your religion entails that's something very well documented in science, such as evolution, is wrong, then that's going to be a death sentence for your religion, I think, going forward. But I don't think that religion should be completely out of the business of providing sort of explanations, because I do think that religions have commitments about how the world is. And although I'm sympathetic to this idea that maybe we should shift it to a more interpretative framework, where you're sort of like interpreting, what we know in this context, but you're not actually claiming anything about what is out there. I think maybe naturally we're sort of shifting towards that. I don't think that it's I don't know. I think religions would lose something if they get completely out of the business of trying to provide explanations or having any commitments in terms of what exists out there. I mean, at least the way I see it, I suppose, is just that a lot of religions still do that, and they would lose a great amount of maybe power, but also meaning to me. Like the term, like a religious framework, to me seems to have some connotations or some teachings, at least, that teach you something about how the world is.
Yeah.
When I think of the concept, at least.
I think this is kind of like a really good point. I think Christianity specifically could have a very strong basis for things like the fact that there's no natural explanation for how somebody can come back from the dead after 3 days, right? So it must be a miracle. There's no natural explanation for how somebody can feed 5,000 people with three fishes and 2 loaves of bread, right? The fact that it has miracles in it, it can be used because all science can do, and this is the issue with a lot of people who use this kind of like going back to this empiricist kind of like scientism approach. They'll be like, where's the evidence for these miracles occurring? Well, that's the fucking point. They're miracles.
Yeah.
They don't have a natural explanation. You're not going to find the answer to that in science. That's the reason that people believe and I'm not saying that people should believe in the miracles. I don't think that that's the case, but I think that if we're going to try and disprove miracles through science, we're going to be kind of pissing into the wind, right? Because it's not a scientific question, right?
Yeah, it was never something that was meant to interact with a scientific mindset.
Exactly.
I'm not exactly sure if I agree completely with that. I guess I see what you're trying to say, right? But for example, if we go back to the prayer idea, right? You could say that could be some sort of a miracle, right? If a prayer is granted, and the thing that someone wishes to happen happens, right? But that is investigatable by science, because you can set up an experiment to check if that is the case or not. I guess if miracles are sort of by definition, because maybe miracle is not the best way to look at prayer, actually, because they seem to be not happening at random, but very sort of non-predictable, right? That's part of sort of what a miracle is to some extent, right? That it's not necessarily something that is very predictable sometimes. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure what I think in that area. I think that a lot of claims that people make that would be considered miraculous are investigatable. And I think James Randi Foundation does a great job, for example, of a lot of these.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think I guess what I'm saying is that the explanation given by theists is that it's an unnatural explanation. It's God that's done it. It's divine intervention. He's
It's
subverting the
outside of
laws of nature in order to make this thing happen. So if you try and if you so if you're trying to say to someone who's a theist that, and this is historical, so obviously today we can investigate people like James Randi has done. We can investigate people's abilities. But in the past, like if you're saying to a theist, there's no scientific way that could happen, they'll be like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, right?
that I agree,
and that seems to be the route that
with.
people go down, right? That's they're like, there's no scientific, the probabilities are so low, and they're like, well, fucking yeah, that's the point, you know. God did that specifically to show us that he exists because he subverted the laws of nature in that moment, right? And this is the issue, you know. You need to target that argument with a little bit more of a different mindset that's not just like, oh, I'm gonna say, you know, it's impossible for somebody to come back from the dead, because yeah, of course.
Something that's interesting to me is that, like you say, miracles are performed on purpose. You know, they are something that like a miracle is supposedly God's will or something, you know, being channeled through a particular individual. It's always done on purpose by a person. And it's interesting that that's one of the requirements for sainthood, is they have to provide, you have to have miracles attributed to you. And I think some people get fast tracked, but for the most part, it's like 200 years. Is it 200 years?
What's that? The most recent one, 200 years ago.
No, well, you have to have been dead for a certain amount of time before you can be officially sainted by the Catholic Church.
Oh, okay.
But I think some people do end up getting fast tracked. But in any case, what's interesting is that before too long, we're going to come to a point where the most recent saints are younger than the internet. And for example, what miracle are they going to attribute to someone like Mother Teresa, who is marked for sainthood already? You know, she's in the waiting list. You know,
I mean,
in 200 years' time, are they going to look back and try and find a miracle to attribute to her?
Yes, that's exactly what they're going to do. You know,
fudge the record. But you can't do that in an age where everything is so rigorously documented and like available to everybody. How is that going to evolve in the future?
Well, maybe that would be the death of that process. You know, that's an interesting thought, and maybe we'll see what happens. You know, and maybe they'll. I mean, I wouldn't put it past people to fabricate in order to achieve that, or to not maybe fabricate, but be like, look how much of a miracle it was that she managed to save so many people. Right?
But no, there are people claiming. There are people that are claiming that she sort of I don't know, cured someone by touching their eyes or something, if I'm not mistaken. I have like a very passing familiarity with Mother Teresa specifically. So I kind of vaguely remember that there were some people claiming that she performed some miracles on them, and that was sort of used. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how this is going to move forward. Definitely.
Yeah.
So yeah, but just to close, I guess my point from before. I guess the best way I can see religions, or at least the explanatory content of religions to survive, is to move to sort of, yeah, I guess to remain in the portion of our explanatory landscape, if you will, that we haven't yet explored so much. And that's just, at that point, I mean, you could say that this is God of the gaps, right?
Sure.
And it is a reasonable thing to say, but at the same time, you can make hypotheses about which metaphysical theory best describes our universe, right? How much they can explain why, like, how the world looks, how the universe looks, and all of these types of things. So, a lot of people forget, but physicalism is sort of a metaphysics as well, in some way, because you're essentially claiming that everything that there is physical, and that's not just a claim about the local things that we can observe right now. It's a claim about sort of the extended everything. So that is sort of a competitor to theism, in a way. And then you sort of just you let these theories fight against each other, and then try to figure out which one is the best to some extent. And
Just got a King Kong
I
versus
hate
Godzilla
that I
image.
can't stop saying, to some extent, why do I keep saying this?
You're to some extent is Joe's in this
it's-
regard.
No, it's frozen in my brain and I can't get rid of it. It's annoying, but yeah, at some point it becomes a discussion in the sort of in metaphysics, right? And then theism becomes just another option that you have, and you can discuss it there. And yeah, it is something that is worth discussing, I think. But don't try to deny science. That would be my biggest advice going forward.
Yeah. There's a you reminded me there's a piece of writing. It's not actually in scripture, but it's kind of a, I think Thomas Aquinas, I think, one of these, writings around scripture, and they said that uh, uh, there are two tools through which we understand God, scripture and creation. And if they seem to contradict each other, then we haven't understood one of them well enough yet. And if you interpret science as the understanding of creation, I think I think you're right. I think there's definitely a place going forward for religion in our sort of like mental ecosystem. We just need to stop trying to force it where it doesn't belong.
Yeah. I think that's the best way.
You would say that as a deist.
That's reasonable. Okay, fine.
And I mean, if you feel uncomfortable with some of the discoveries of science, I think you might want to consider, changing your outlook a bit. If you feel like that is incompatible with your religious worldview, something has to give. And my advice is, just don't try to make like science the thing that you're dismissing. Right? Maybe you should figure out something else that to make everything fit.
Especially not well-established science, like evolution. I think is one of the
bestly
supported theories that humans have ever come up with, and to try and dismiss it outright, I think, is a mistake. And the thing is, like, when you watch the videos of people trying to dismiss it, their arguments show that they clearly don't understand it, which is really problematic, because it's like you haven't even understood this fully, and now you're trying to debunk it, and it's not working.
Yeah.
And at this point, not that the Catholic Church is the be all and end all, but they do tend to be. Well, that's the thing, and they tend to be the ones that drag their feet on this sort of thing.
And they did drag their feet for a long time, And then they were like, "Wow, we can't." It's like the heliocentric model as well, though. They dragged their feet on that.
Sure,
they murdered a couple of people for it, and then they were like, "Actually, the stars say otherwise."
If even they are accepting that is the way things are, why are we still talking about it? Why is it still such a problem?
I mean, I get why it is a problem. I think I can see why it is a problem. I don't think that that the marriage between at least certain brands of Christianity and evolution is a happy one. I think it's not comfortable to be there. I don't think it's incompatible, right? I don't think that evolution is incompatible with Christianity, but I don't think it sits well with Christianity, at least on some interpretations of Christianity. I think it's an uncomfortable fit, and I can see why people would push back against this. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be so. Like, I don't think, even just as a simple strategy from a pragmatic perspective, I don't think that's a good way to move forward, because eventually it's going to be increasingly hard to push that narrative forward, and then you're just going to look like a fool, and you're going to end up in a situation that is worse than where you started. So yeah, and as you mentioned, Luke, there is a distinction between well-established science and sort of like the I guess the things on the edge of discovery. And there is a lot of room in interpreting the results that science gives us. That's also another thing that I guess is interesting to explore.
So that's something else. Yeah. Sorry, Philip, Karen.
Yeah, but just I guess don't dismiss the findings themselves. That would be the best way to look at it.
I guess that's what I was going to bring up, because I think people who talk about science have no clue about statistics, which is the predominant kind of technique that we use to analyze the data that we have, right? And in order to understand the science, you need to be able to understand the statistics to even a certain extent. So what is a significance rating? What is an effect size? Because, you know, like if I said there was a significant difference between burnt toast and unburnt toast on cancer ratings, right? That may be true. There may be a significant difference, but what's the effect size? How much of a difference is there? That's, people barely ever look at how much of a difference there is, which is, like, for me, one of the most important things. It's not only important that it's significant, it's important that it's large, because if you're saying, like, for instance, like, the amount of times I hear fucking atheists say, oh, atheists are on average more intelligent than theists, and then you look at the stats and it's like by like 0.05% or something like that. It's like, what's the point? How is that even a difference? You know, like, it's so silly. So yeah, that's the key for me. Is like, people should understand philosophy to a certain extent, but people should also understand statistics as well, because
but that's the beauty of philosophy, because inductive reasoning is very much about that type of thinking, right? To figure out you know, how we draw conclusions from those types of data points, and make probabilistic judgments based on data. So yeah, I mean, going through statistics is approaching it from like the same topic, essentially from a different perspective, but you're studying very similar things.
Just I think I had another point. Just this question from Gregory, because I think it's been a really good question. There's another point I want to raise, just about again, like, religion and science aren't at odds with each other directly. Science, and this is something that I think that people who are like empiricists or whatever, and something that we've discussed already, is understanding the limitations of science and what science is used for, and that it's a tool. It's not it's not knowledge. It's not the kind of like everything that we are aware of or know or believe. It's not like, it's a specific tool for a specific purpose, and I think that us as a society need to be more aware of that, because there's things that scientists can answer and there's things that scientists can't answer. For instance, the experiential sorry, let me rephrase this. I'm trying to use too long of words. The experience of what it's like to be trans. Right? That's not necessarily a scientific question. You know?
Sure.
But Richard Dawkins thinks that people who are trans shouldn't exist, really, seems. Or that they shouldn't have the same rights as other people. You know? And he's a scientist, he's a biologist. He has a very kind of like not nuanced. he has a very kind of
Opposite.
limited kind of like he's not even like a full biologist, he's an evolutionary biologist. Right, he has a very good understanding of biology, I have no doubt about that.
But he is a very good evolutionary
He's a very good
biologist,
evolutionary
right?
biologist.
Very good evolutionary
He's not a
biologist.
fucking psychologist, he's not
That's correct.
he's not a psychiatrist, and he's not trans. So, you know,
Most important.
yeah, so, you know, people that are kind of like taking his approach and following him, thinking he must know what he's talking about because he's a scientist. You know, there's a tool and a place, and science is not, for me, not the answer to the question around trans rights. You know, we need to be thinking about empathy. We need to be thinking about their experiences and what they are saying, they are feeling, and we need to be looking. The only place where science comes into it is looking at the statistical data about trans offence rates and seeing whether they actually match what the TERFs are saying about how often trans people are going to actually attack people. Because I guarantee you they'll be lower than the general population, much lower, right? And it's ridiculous. It's an absolute folk devil. It annoys me. I had to get that right now. Sorry.
Sorry, Luke. I kind of need to go.
I need to go as well. So, shall we wrap things up quickly then?
Sure.
Cool. So, I guess, you know, we all agree that science has a specific purpose. It has a specific kind of like use that we should be doing. We shouldn't be overselling it or saying what, you know, like not using other techniques to find knowledge and to find awareness of things. We should be aware of its limitations, and we should actually know what we're talking about before we comment on stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty much the bottom line. Although I will say that I'm not exactly sure if I agree with the idea that they're completely like that religion and science are completely not in conflict in any sort of way. I'm sort of in between, right? I don't think that they're incompatible, but I think that there is more than one way in which there is tension in certain things that are happening.
But I think that's more from science. I don't think it's science that is in tension with religion. I think it is. I think if it's anything, it's religion has tension from science rather than the other way around. If that makes sense, I think that direction is really important, and I think that it's scientists or people that are like kind of following science that are in tension with religion.
I think it probably ties back to what you were saying about its become an institution. You know, science and religion don't necessarily have to be in conflict, but the people who are carrying out that conflict have purposes and agendas and their own machinations that they're going to use whatever side they're on to further.
Precisely.
And that's, you know,
institutions are in conflict.
Science and religion cannot be in conflict. People can be in conflict using science and religion to beat each other with, essentially.
I don't know if I agree. It depends on what you mean by religion, because if you mean by religion sort of a collection of ideas surrounding how the universe is, I think in science as a collection of findings, I guess, about how the universe is, then there is tension there, like at face value, I think, in the sense that not for all religions, right, but for specific religions. Like even if you just take the, like, first of all, you could say that there is tension in the methodology of finding out about the universe, right? Because in one case you have a sort of way of looking at things where you're just asking God, for example, or interrogating a scripture to some extent, right, to find out about the truth. And the other one is sort of like a more methodical approach. So, I mean, there are different approaches. They're not necessarily in conflict, but yeah, they're different. But then you go on and look at how, for example, scientific explanations have a history of overcoming supernatural and religious explanations for things, right? Like you can see the history of mankind sort of as, and you illustrated this actually at the beginning very, very well, I think, where, you sort of hear the thunder, right? And you say, oh, that must be this thing, right? But then science comes along, and then you sort of try to understand better, and then you discover that actually, oh no, actually that's not really the thing. So there is a history and a tendency there of scientific explanations replacing religious explanations that I think makes it a bit tense. And then there are sort of other like observations that you can make that are scientific, that are sort of are uncomfortable on certain religious worldviews. Like, for example, you might say, I mean, evolution, if I want to bring this up now, it doesn't sit really well on, for example, Christian theism and on the idea of a loving God, not because it's incompatible with it, but because you wouldn't expect God to bring about life in such a way, right, when he has other means available. Both because it's like it doesn't really make sense because it's not really that efficient, right? But also because evolution is a very bloody process that is arguably requires a lot of suffering for as its engine to work. And that's not something that you would expect on the hypothesis that a loving God created the universe, because it doesn't really seem to fit well. So there are certain observations that science makes that kind of don't sit great with religious explanations. That doesn't mean that they're incompatible. That doesn't mean that you cannot square them, right? There are ways to square them, and I think there are ways to square them to some extent that are successful. But it doesn't mean that there is absolutely no tension here, because I think
no, I agree with that.
Going too far.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I definitely agree with you, actually. And actually, I think that would be a very good topic for another stream. I think that we could probably get into some real meat there, and discuss what is it that what is compatible and what is incompatible. So thanks for the idea, Philip. Appreciate it. And I'm aware you need to leave, Harry, and I also need to go because I'm thirsty. So we'll end the stream there. Thank you guys for joining us. So yeah, I'm not going to do Joe's thing this time. So we're just going to say goodbye. See you later, guys. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact.